morning, according depending on where you are. This is the second day of a week-long series of online side events in preparation for the second segment of the fourth meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Minamata Convention. Thank you very much for your participation in this event, and we certainly look forward to your participation in other events throughout this week of thought-provoking discussions. Side events are an important part of the Minamata Convention Conference of the Parties. They provide an opportunity to exchange information and bring advances in technology, research, and policy to the attention of the parties and to the global community that the convention serves. The Secretariat is proud to present to you a side event entitled Role of Science Policy Interface in Strengthening Implementation of Minamata Convention, which has been organized by the UNEP's Law Division. My name is Eisak Toda, Senior Program Officer of the Minamata Convention Secretariat in charge of scientific issues, and I am happy to moderate this very timely and important event. Before starting the event, I'd like to go over a couple of quick housekeeping notes. If you may wish to test your speaker microphone setting by opening the audio video menu at the top left corner of your screen. You can open the participants panel and chat panel by clicking the respective icon at the bottom right corner of your screen. If the moderator opens the floor and if you wish to take the floor, please click the raise hand icon that appears next to you, your name on the participant panel. The moderator will call names based on the order of the raised hands and allow you to unmute. When you are named, please unmute yourself and speak. When your speaking is over, kindly mute yourself and click the lower hand icon. You may also wish to type questions in the chat box and send to everyone. And this is important because you can type your questions while listening to the presentation and discussion so that we can take up good questions when at the panel discussion. If you need any technical assistance, please put your message in the chat box and send it to the host. I think the host is displayed as Shariful Islam host. Kindly note that this session is recorded and broadcasted. Recording of this session and the presentation slides will be made available through the Minamata Convention website after the session. So with this, I am happy to open this side event. I repeat the title again, Role of Science Policy Interface in Strengthening Implementation of Minamata Convention. This event is very timely. We see science driving international policy to combat three planetary crises, climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Last week, a new IPCC report highlighted the impact of climate change on biodiversity. The fifth meeting of the United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA, and UNEP at 50 event had intensive discussion on science policy interface and adopted an important resolution on science policy panel to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution. I am very honored to moderate this very important event happening just after UNEA 5 and just before Minamata COP4. And with this, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Balakrishna Pisupati, the UNEP Law Division, who is the lead author of the key publication for UNEA and UNEP at 50 on science policy interface, to lead us through the topic. So, Bala, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. It's a great pleasure to be with you this time. As mentioned, we actually are preparing for the in-person meeting of the Conference of Parties to the Minamata Convention on Mercury. So certainly, as indicated in the introduction, the role of science policy interface has received a lot of attention in the recent years. And to just give you a quick recap, on the 3rd of March, UNEP celebrated the 50th anniversary of establishment of the United Nations Environment Program. That, as many of you would have recognized, was born out of the 1972 Stockholm Summit. Of course, the focus of the 50th anniversary has been on how to strengthen the science policy interface and position UNEP into the future. And I'm very glad to be sharing some elements of the thinking that went into preparing the report, elements of the report itself, but also leave you with some ideas that UNEP is actively considering to pursue the future directions of science policy interface. As mentioned, my name is Balakrishna Pisupati. I work at the Law Division at UNEP, and I will serve as a focal point for the science policy interface related work. And with that, I would like to share with you a short presentation that provides you a bit of a background about this issue and elements of the report. May I have the next slide, please? Many of you actually are aware that there have been many successful approaches of combining science and policy, science informing policy and policy getting impacted by the findings of science. Scientists and policymakers have long worked together in terms of establishing a number of programs, a number of successful initiatives, a number of platforms and activities to address a lot of environmental challenges that we've been facing for many, many years. What you see on the screen are some of those approaches in the form of reports like the Global Environment Outlook report. The UN Secretary General had launched a report called Making Peace with Nature, which was in 2021. And we have a number of reports that UNEP and a number of organizations working on environmental management does produce that is based on scientific elements. We also have science policy platforms. We have the Independent Resource Panel of UNEP. We have the panel that focuses on chemicals. We have the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Science Policy Business Forum. So a number of platforms also bring in scientists and policymakers together. In addition, there are also a number of coalitions, campaigns, formal UN collaborations, like we have what is called the Environment Management Group of the UN, UNEP serving as a secretariat for the Environment Management Group, that brings in a number of UN agencies working on environmental issues together. We have a number of international regimes, but most importantly, if one is able to be identifying the most tangible expression of how science policy interface is actually working and being implemented on the ground, a number of multilateral environmental agreements, including the Minamata Convention, serves as a great example of how science policy had worked to put this entire initiative, the convention, together. And what we are discussing today is in the context of science policy interface. The next slide. And of course, many of you would have learned or heard about a number of models that focus on science policy interface. And essentially what you see on the screen are some of those elements. Translating science to inform policy that is guided by science. We also have evidence-based policy making, but that also needs to be communicated appropriately so that forward and backward loops of science informing policy and policy picking up activities and providing frameworks, providing actions and strategies based on science that is appropriately communicated has been a long-standing element of the model. And of course, there are in the academic literature 3 significant models. One is what is called the science push model. We have what is called the policy pull model, and the third one is what is called as a co-production model. But at UNEP, in preparation for the 50th anniversary, we are now suggesting, the details are yet to be published. We are working on finalizing that model, where we are suggesting a circularity model that looks at not just science policy, but also looking at the impact and the relevance of society that includes all different stakeholders as a part of this debate. So it's science policy society interface and no more just science policy interface per se. The next slide. A number of lessons have been learned in several years of working on science policy interface. Number one, the socio-political and economic context globally have changed. Many of us are witnessing some of these day in and day out. Science is evolving very rapidly, but the speed with which policy making is trying to keep up with that evolving science is sometimes always a bit of a struggle. There is a bit of a time gap between the way science is evolving and the speed with which policymakers or policy making respond to some of the elements of science. Even the IPCC report that was mentioned in the introduction is an example of that particular time gap between how much of science we know and how much of the science is being picked up by policy making and by policymakers. The social consciousness and awareness related to environment has also increased tremendously, essentially the young generation. And that is why in UNEP, we now are making very conscious efforts to include and mainstream youth and youth voices as a part of our work on issues related to science policy interface. Interactions between sectors and society are also changing, whether it is private sector, whether it is public-private sector partnerships, whether these are partnerships with non-governmental civil society organizations, women groups. So certainly the societal input or impact on science policy has also taken a very different turn thanks to our ability to inform people. Social media has certainly enhanced the ability of people to access information. Of course, there is also a small downside to that of the bit of misinformation. But other than that, social media platforms have provided a larger access to a number of sectors on issues related to science policy. But there is also a bit of an uncertainty and risks that challenges decision making, because a lot of times we actually are confronted with challenges that are more immediate, and our responses also need to be immediate. And sometimes because of various reasons, we are also impacted by the long-term horizon that we need to have in mind when designing some of those interfaces actively. Can I have the next slide? So keeping that in mind, the report that was launched a few days ago looks at a few observations that science policy interface is non-linear. Secondly, the political process are integral to science policy interface functioning and evolution. Even how much ever we may want to keep science policy apolitical, politics and certainly the political influences, as many of us are aware, do make an impact on the way science policy interface works. The movement towards crafting solutions is more important than stating problems. There is also a kind of a conscious decision that UNEP has taken during the leadership dialogue with ministers of environment, where the move is more not towards stating the problems, but finding solutions, and also to need to engage with right actors, right evidence, and productive exchange. Next slide, please. So UNEP actually had many calls for action. The UN Environment Assembly resolutions have asked UNEP to respond to that, including the Our Common Agenda, which was actually launched by the Secretary General of United Nations, that reflected on the lessons learned and suggested UNEP should be focusing more into the future on strengthening science policy interface. The next slide. So considering that UNEP does those four functions in the relation to science policy interface, where looking at generating knowledge, brokering different actors and sectors to come together, synthesizing the information, data, and knowledge, and communicating the outcomes of it as the core functions of UNEP, UNEP's activities in the future is based on some of those four parameters. The next one, next slide, please. So the considerations are to have inclusive and distributive multilateralism that underpin our future work. Consideration for post-normal science, need to strengthen the natural and social sciences base, and also developing metrics and indicators by which we can measure the impact of science policy interface that is going to be put in place in the months and years to come. The next slide. So the role of SPI is to create impact, is to work on the trends that are emerging, is to look at influencing a lot of actions on the ground, and also be very responsive. So those are some of the four enablers that this report that was launched a few days ago had already indicated as a precursor to strengthening science policy interface into the future. The next slide. So how do we prepare for future? Those are some of the points that are elaborated in the report: addressing traditional knowledge, engaging with broader array of stakeholders, ensuring that we are more efficient and transparent in the scientific effort, being open and accessible for data and information and knowledge, need to be able to deal with complex subjects, but more reflexive, dynamic, and agile models to be used, and the processes to facilitate exchange of scientific evidence and place in the context of social values. I think this is something which we have indicated as a strong point as and when UNEP prepares delivering science policy interface related activities into the future. The next slide. The report looks at some of those elements, the interface between science policy, but also society, influencing environmental management and governance, looks at key lessons learned and reimagining the future. The next slide. That looks at inclusivity, that looks at focus, behavioral change, and use of technology. The next slide. So the future considerations for science policy interface is looking at environmental multilateralism that relies on an effective science policy societal interface, focusing on science policy links, society links that are critical to making policy making more transdisciplinary and multi-sectoral, and science policy society interface should consider knowledge as a factor than an information. The next slide. So in the context of some of these considerations, UNEP actually have decided to focus on 4 overarching ideas into the future. One is to work on enabling open, accessible, transparent data, information, and knowledge, placing more emphasis on solutions rather than challenges, embracing diverse range of stakeholders and partners, and engaging with a variety of decision makers and influencers. The next slide, please. So in the context of the COP and Minamata, those are the 4 elements that are very critical as we prepare to deliver on science policy interface in the context of the convention. Managing Mercury, community engagement, enabling conditions to be properly understood and put in place, and creating an impact. So if we can consider all of them, then certainly the report that was published on strengthening the science policy interface with respect to chemicals management that was launched in 2020 could be further strengthened. And at UNEP, we actually are looking forward to the discussions and outcomes of the COP to further strengthen some of these ideas and engage with a number of stakeholders, including parties to the convention, in terms of strengthening the science policy society interface. So I stop there and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Bala, for the very, very inspiring and very, hot from the oven information on the outcome from the UNEA and UNEP at 50 event. And so I think this is a very good information or material for the panel discussion. Today, we have distinguished 4 panelists, each of whom has a very profound experience in science policy interface in the environmental issues and sustainable development. So I like to go into the panel discussion, but before that, from the Minamata Convention's point of view, I would like to note that Minamata Convention is itself was born from the scientific findings, and the Minamata Convention was adopted in 2013, and the negotiation started with a recognition of the scientific evidence that mercury is really a global pollutant, which perhaps comes from the UNEP global mercury assessment report. And I feel that this is quite parallel to the IPCC first assessment report in 1988 or 89. I forgot which year it was, and then it resulted in the adoption of UNFCCC in 1992. So I think the international policy making on environmental management to combat the triple planetary crisis was driven by science. So I'd like to first introduce the first panelist, Dr. Linville Martin of the International Conference on Mercury as a Global Pollutant. And as the name of this conference shows, this is a scientific gathering that acknowledges the mercury as a global pollutant, and the scientific evidence emerging from the scientific community a, had a very profound influence on the development of the Minamata Convention. So I'd like to have start this panel discussion with one guiding question, which is based on your experience. Please share examples when the scientific knowledge and evidence have successfully assisted in tackling environmental challenges. In your view, what are the major challenges in utilizing science more effectively as a basis for decision making, and how could these challenges be addressed? So, Linville, what is your response?
So good afternoon, evening, morning, everybody. Thank you, Isaku, for the opportunity to represent I would say the Mercury research community as chairman of the International Conference on Mercury as a Global Pollutant. I think you have already mentioned some of the pointers which I wanted to make, but in any case, I just want to highlight again what Isaku has mentioned, is that I think, in my opinion, currently where things are standing in terms of the Minamata Convention, science definitely played a very important and I would say a big role for where things are currently now. I mean, if we take it back to what happened back in the early 60s with the whole incident in Japan, it was science and it was research that ultimately highlight the fact what happened in the Minamata Bay and the effect it had on the people and on the population of that area. So I think it was through science that this was highlighted, and as more researchers we became involved within specifically mercury research or heavy metal research, I think this further highlights the dangers mercury has, although there's a lot of benefits also towards using mercury. But I think through the research in the early 60s and 70s and 80s, this definitely highlighted the dangers this has for us as humans, and especially for the environment and health. And I think what has also been going on is that the fact that through early reports from the Global Mercury Assessment, I think the first report came out in 2002, if I'm not mistaken. And after that, there was I think every 5 or 6 years, these reports was coming out. I think through those reports also placed the dangers of mercury on the agenda for international committees like UN, the World Health Organization, etc., etc. So a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of research went into mercury research before I think it caught the attention of the policymakers. And I mean, we are grateful that science could play such an important role. And I think once the agenda arrived, on the international stage, and also the importance, especially the health impacts there is for countries. I think that is why I think when the opportunity came for countries to sign the Minamata Convention in 2013, I think there was about 133 countries that then signed the Minamata Convention, indicating that they also support the science basically. and that mercury is definitely a global pollutant. From the ICP GM side of things, I think what is important for us as researchers is that we want to work as closely with the policymakers in terms of what the next steps will be. I mean, if you look at some of the sessions that has been ongoing in the past 2 or 3 ICGMP conferences, you will see that there's a lot of sessions that focus on science that can influence the Minamata Convention, as well as science that looks at the effectiveness evaluation of the Minamata Convention. And I think that is key for us as scientists, is that as a scientist, you have your own interest in what you want to achieve in your research, but then also I think it's also very important to also have a group of scientists that direct their research that specifically can speak to the Minamata Convention. And I think there is definitely growth in that area for researchers. Even if you look at the current publications of some of the researchers or of some of the research that is coming out now today, is that the research which people are doing is targeted towards either the effectiveness evaluation or some aspect that speaks to one of the articles within the convention of the Minamata Convention. I think that is very clear. That is very key. And I think one other important thing is that, at least in my view of things, from the researcher side, there's always been the eagerness to work closely with policymakers. On the other side, we haven't been able to find that as much. But I think that gap that was also there, that is also starting to improve. If you look at some of the researchers that do present at ICGMP meetings, some of them are part of countries' delegations now. They are expert advisories to people that comes to COPs. And this is very encouraging to see that from a scientific point of view, that parties do acknowledge the important roles these experts and people play. Thank you, Isaku.
Thank you, Linville. And yeah, I think I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself, but you're so modest that you didn't promote the ICMGP meeting. And the ICMGP is biennial scientific meeting on Mercury, and it was planned last year in Cape Town, but because of the pandemic, the decision was made to have it first in online format in July this year, and then in 2 years,
in 2 years,
1924. There will be a face-to-face meeting in Cape Town, and the abstract submission deadline is 15th of March, I think. So,
yes. So there's still time. Yeah, there's still time.
So, thank you, Linville, and also to the panelists, please feel free to provide any information in the chat box. Thanks, Bala, for posting the link to the report that you authored for UNEP at 50 event. So then I would like to turn to the next panelist, Juliette Grace Luete, who has a very good experience in encouraging youth community to be involved in the challenges for sustainable development, and she's from Media Challenge Initiative. So I'm asking you the same question, and of course, since this is an interactive panel discussion, you can ask questions to other panelists. So, having said this, my question was about the examples when the science drove the policy making and the major challenges and how these challenges may be addressed. Juliette, I think you can.
Yeah,
Take your microphone.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, moderator. I think, as introduced, my name is Juliet Grace Luede. I am from Uganda. I definitely work with young people because I'm a young person myself, but then I also have a very special interest in the media because I am of the view that it's through the media that we are able to communicate complex issues like science itself to the masses and to ensure that people actually take positive action. And to answer your question, I think for me, how I've seen science work is that for the case of Uganda, our current national action plan for artisan and small scale gold mining was actually backed as a result of us being a signatory to the Minamata Convention on Mercury. Before that space of the artisan and small scale gold mining wasn't really being paid attention to, and we weren't really paying attention to the effects of Mercury on the miners and what kind of impact it has on our environment, and the people as well that deal with this on a day-to-day basis. But in 2018, national mean matter initial assessment studies was carried out. And this for us as a country was an eye-opener, like I earlier said, to the emissions that were within the sector. And because of this, now we're able to really direct our efforts as a country into ensuring how do we, one, protect our environment, even in as much as we are gaining from the gold mining, but at the same time also ensure that our communities and our people who are in this sector actually also protected, because mercury has a lot of health risks that come with it. But then when you look at the sector, I'll give an example of Mubende, where a lot of gold mining happens. It's mostly the women and young people that were actually involved in this practice, but they were not protected. But because of the science and all the studies that was done around this policy and plan that we now have in place is able to protect these people against in all the issues that come as a result of the mining processes and the mercury itself. Maybe one of the things that I've seen happen is there is still very low communication about the Minamata Convention on Mercury here in Uganda. Before this session last week, when I was invited to be a speaker, I had to reach out to a couple of young people within my sector in the media space and ask them, how many of you know about this convention and what it actually says for us as a person in Uganda? And I am sad to say that majority of even the journalists, senior journalists and editors within the media spaces were hearing of it for the very first time. But at the same time, we're very cognizant of the fact that a lot of gold mining does happen in the country, in the northern part of the country, but we weren't aware of the policies that really support this practice. Many people were not even aware of the convention itself, and even when, as a country, we signed on to it. So for me, this actually revealed that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of educating the masses about the convention itself and how all individuals fit into it. I want to reflect on the slides that were shared by Krishna, especially the slide that was talking about preparing for the future. How do we address that traditional knowledge? And this is where, as again, as people within the media space come through to actually make sure that we bridge this gap. And I'm happy that this report that has been produced by UNEP kind of addresses this question. So now the next task for us is how do we actually break this report down even further to the masses? How do we break the science even further to the people out there so that they can effectively benefit from it, such that the work that's being done by Balakrishna does not stay on his desk, but actually reaches the people for which it has been designed for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliet. I think I was impressed by the two points you made. One is the ASGM, the artisanal small scale gold mining. This is a kind of jargon in the Mercury community. But as I recall, the first global mercury assessment in 2002 said that the largest emission source is called combustion. But then the second and third reports confirming that ASG and the gold mining is indeed the largest source of emissions, and that is the scientific knowledge, and that drove the negotiation of Minamata Conventions, focusing, putting as much focus on the gold mining as the direct emission. And also as your remark reminded me about the point that Bara mentioned, the community involvement in the science policy interface. So I think this is a very good input to the panel discussion. Then I would like to turn to the third panelist, Elena Limberdi Settimo of the Zero Working Group and the European Environmental Bureau, who has have long been working on the input to mercury discussion, as well as other chemicals management, international policy making. So, Elena, please start from the brief introduction, self-introduction. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Isaacu, and everybody. Thank you to UNEP and the organizers for this invitation. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Yeah, my name is Elena Limberidi Settimo. I've been managing the Mercury work at the European Environmental Bureau, which is based in Brussels. It's the largest NGO network at the EU level. And since 2005, I've been co-founding and co-leading now the international work of the Zero Mercury Working Group, which is an international coalition of over 110 NGOs from over 55 countries. The aim, of course, is to reduce mercury in the global environment to a minimum, and we've been supporting the Minamata Convention, well, since before it was the Minamata Convention. So should I go into the answering the questions already, Isaacu?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, the examples are, yeah, there are so many. I mean, also, I've seen so many in all these 15 years and over working on mercury. So some examples can be seen also at the EU level. For example, at the very beginning, when we were discussing about measuring devices, it was important to have, we had some studies which we had even commissioned ourselves, which showed the extent of the issue of mercury used in those devices. But then it was very important that the EU Scientific Committee confirmed, for example, that there was no problem with the accuracy of the alternatives, and that the alternatives, the digital thermometers and even the sphygmomanometers, even the possibility to calibrate those without mercury. So these were some issues that were really blocking sometimes the policy discussions. So as soon as these were clarified by the scientific community and by the scientists, which were widely accepted, this assisted in moving towards an early phase out at the EU. Other examples, which are actually also very recent, and as you know, we've been discussing a lot, especially the last couple of years, about mercury fluorescent lamps. So there have been new studies which have come out very recently, and they brought to light current data. So also how often do we produce the data matters also, because in some cases the markets that we're discussing are moving very fast. So in the lighting sector, for example, studies based on data a few years back, they were completely out of date, and they were rather misleading when we were trying to interpret them and to use the results for policy decisions. So, for example, earlier data, this latest data that came out from the Swedish Energy Agency and GLASP have been instrumental actually into moving decisions at the EU forward. in the sense that we could be moving towards a banning of the fluorescent lamps, and we will be discussing this in a later event today. Also, another example, I think, is it was mentioned also beyond, of course, the GMAs, some early studies that were done on the trade and the flows of mercury already in 2007, and then later after that. These reports, I think, have been instrumental in to show the effect and the harm also in developing countries. And on the base of those, also the countries stepped forward and asked for concrete actions at the very early stages when we were discussing whether we go towards a convention or not. So this was at governing council level at the time. So again, I mean, there are so many examples, and I mean, and also there will be future needs. For example, there are some needs that we have identified looking further, for example, into the mercury compounds, which is part of Article 3, but it's not really looked at for the time being. So a first step, for example, could be an assessment of the global supply, trade, and use of mercury compounds, comparable to studies which have been done before. So this is just to state, a few examples which I think have been really instrumental into moving certain policies towards one direction or the other. Then, in terms of the challenges, I mean, the challenges sometimes in the science, it could be on who presents the scientific evidence. The interpretation may differ sometimes. And we have unfortunately seen manipulation of the science, sometimes by industry, which this can be a major challenge. This was also affirmed by the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights last year. So these are some issues that, of course, we need to consider. On the other hand, of course, it's important that the science and providing the science and also communicating the science, as it was mentioned earlier, is important, and that it comes from a broader area of actors. Another important, of course, challenge is that actions needed are often taking unnecessary long time to implement because of short-time economic considerations, where large profits are used to support continued use of toxic products. So this as well, I mean, we have seen it in many areas. It comes out also in the mercury world on different areas of work. So these are some issues to I think that we need to consider when we are looking at the science. But of course, as been mentioned before, it's very important to have this information to advance with the policy. I don't know, I could stop here for the interest of time. Otherwise, there are so many other things that could still be mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. I think you raised a very important points, starting from the importance of the scientific consensus building, and the need for impartiality, and also the need to consider the time needed, and trying not to waste time in protracted discussions. So and before turning to the last panelists, I like to encourage the audience participants to put your questions in the chat box, because our game plan is that after this round of first panel, we would like to take up some questions from the floor, and it will be easier for us to see the questions in the chat box and prepare a discussion. We may be able to take up some questions from the floor, but I encourage the audience to put your questions in the chat. So having said this, I'd like to introduce last panelist, Sang-Yoon Wang. of the Zurich Institute of Technology. I'm not sure whether this is a correct translation of ETHZ, but anyhow, he's a board member of the International Panel on Chemical Pollution, and since he's from Zurich, he has been very influential in the discussion on the science policy interface in chemicals and waste, and as you may know, the Switzerland was the leader in this discussion in the UNEP 5 resolution on the science policy panel on chemicals waste and pollution. So I turn to you and with the same question, and please start with a brief introduction and then respond to the guiding question. Sanyu.
Yeah. Thanks, Isaku, and also many thanks for the Minamata Secretariat and the UNEP Law Division for the invitation. My name is Jianwen Wang. I'm a scientist at the I'm an environmental chemist by training, working on the chemicals pollution issues for the past decade. I'm also the member of the International Panel on Chemical Pollution. This is an international network of academic scientists from all regions of the world supporting environmental and human health protection from chemical pollution. I would also like to thank the other speakers for their very interesting food for thought. I very much agree with all the speakers so far that we have very many very good examples illustrating science and policy co-productions. And particularly also in the field of chemicals and waste, apart from all these very good examples of the Mercury side, also like to reflect that like we have the early research into DDT in the 1950s was the very important basis for silent spraying, which then was a direct trigger for establishing the US EPA in the 1969 and also inspiring many other international actions. We'll also like to point out that another very encouraging example was the ozone depleting substances, where Molina and Roland published a paper in 1974, and also inspiring the subsequent detection of the ozone hole in the polar regions, which led to like the scientific and policy community working together, resulting in the very fast negotiation and the adoption of the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol. There are many these very good examples. Also, the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, the Stockholm Convention, and also the creation of the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, AMAP. So I will say that there have been a lot of very encouraging developments. However, more is really needed. I will say that one major current challenge is that science and policy are both becoming increasingly complex. On the scientific side, every year, over like 20,000 scientific papers are being published on different areas of chemical pollution. At the same time, many policy processes run in parallel. It is increasingly difficult for both scientists and policymakers to keep up with the developments by their counterparts, which I agree with very much with what also the UNEP report also highlighted. Therefore, I think we really need to have more dedicated science policy work. So it is not only about science, it's not about policy, but it really to bring the science and policy together with a very wide scope to foster smooth and efficient communication between the two communities so that they can support each other in a timely manner. And such work also needs to engage the wide academic scientific community. This will also help us to answer the questions that has been raised, like who speaks for science. It's the wide academic scientific community speak for science. And I will also, to do so, I will also very much agree with Dr. Martin that the science policy work as the interface needs to be well recognized and also take the societal context and social values into considerations. That will be my intervention so far, that we have a lot of really good examples, good work, but we need to do more really to strengthen the global science policy interface and also to recognize the importance of such work. It's really about the two communities to like the work is to foster the two communities to work together in a timely and efficient manner. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tan Yu. And yeah, it's good that you mentioned many important examples of the Rachel Carson Science Spring, which is in fact it's one health. It's disappearing birds that affects the human health. So this is the one health issue, and also ozone depleting substances and so on. And having said this, I'm looking at the chat box, but we don't see any questions. But since this is a panel discussion, interactive discussion, I would also invite the panelists to ask questions to each other. But I open the floor. If any of the attendees have any question, you can raise your hand, and I think we can monitor the list of participants. But before and while waiting for any hand, do you have any question to any of the panelists? If not, I think well, before going to the last question, which is I will I will ask you to prepare for the last round, the second round, which is what do you think would be the single most powerful action for promoting, strengthening science policy interface at the international and national levels to advance global environmental agenda. So I think I would invite you to propose a single most powerful action that you would recommend to the international community. But since we have 8 minutes left, I think may I ask San Yun about your experience in being involved in the recent UNEP 5 decision on science policy panel, and what kind of panel do you envisage from the intersectional work up to UNEP 6?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. I think there have been a lot of expectations from the scientific community that this will really help to capture the emerging issues and so to conduct really a lot of the horizon scanning and early warnings, so that this will help to inform the policymakers so that we can work in a like a proactive way to address the global threat of chemical pollution instead of the current modes that we largely address all the issues in a reactive manner. So I think this has been a lot of expectations in terms of the function, the working scope of this panel. There's also a lot of the, I think there's also a really good understanding among different stakeholders that this panel needs to be independent and balanced to be protected from the conflict of interests. So there's a lot of discussions will be ongoing, and how can we really to establish very effective and efficient rules and procedures to really to protect from the to make sure that this panel works in a credible, authoritative, transparent manner. I think the third point that I would like to make is that also this panel needs to be balanced in terms of the gender and the regional perspectives. So because the chemicals and waste, they do not recognize national boundaries, and also they do not recognize, and sometimes, and in many cases, women, elderly, and children are the particularly vulnerable populations. So we really need to address all these the needs of the vulnerable populations, and also address the needs of the developing countries. Then the fourth point is that chemicals and waste are very big fields. So, and I really like what the report, the previous speaker talking about the UNEP reports, is that we need to have a very agile and responsive mode, so that we can really address the needs as they arise. So I think these are the 4 points that I would think about. Is like, the panel needs to conduct horizontal scanning and early warning, needs to be very like protected from the conflict of interests, and needs to be inclusive in terms of the regions and the gender balance. And the fourth point is that it's very agile and responsive. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Yun. So we have 4 minutes, and we have a last question, and we see a one question from in the chat from Mixito of UNEP Pro-Up about how we can help in combating the fake information. So perhaps you may address this question as well. So I like to go around in the same order, and then I will turn to Bala to summarize. So very brief remark about one single action you recommend to the international national community to strengthen science policy interface. Linville.
It's difficult to say one, I'll name two. I would say, first of all, empowering the researchers within each country. I think that is vital. Connect with them. And also, I would say also proper communication from the policy side to the scientific community within each country. A simple example, another COP meeting is coming up now recently. It would be nice after that meeting if the people that attended those meetings give quick feedback to the scientists of their country, or recognize people within their country that does these type of work, that they at least know what is going on and how the road looks ahead. Thanks, Isako.
Thank you, Linville. So, Juliet, what is your recommendation?
I think my recommendation is not really different from what Linville has just shared. Is empowering the researchers to be able to break down even this research further, so that it's not actually only designed for scientists to understand it, but because when you look at the science in itself, it does not only affect the scientists, but then it also affects how we go about the policy making decisions and mechanism. So there is that gap that needs to be bridged. How do we ensure that what the science are communicating is effectively understood by the people for whom the science has been designed for? So, and what this requires is a lot of collaboration, say, between the scientists and us, the people within the media space, who actually now reach out to the people on the ground who are definitely affected by the science that is being communicated. The other thing is actually mentioned in Balakrishna's presentation. How do we break down and make that data and information more accessible? Is it a thing of using the media? We have the social media as well. How do we put it in form of infographics in a language that it's easier for people to digest? Because I feel like if we are able to achieve this, then more people will come on board and definitely support the work that's being done by the convention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliet. This is a very rich conversation. So, Elena.
Yes, thank you. I don't know if there is much to say because I think a lot has been covered by the previous speakers. Yeah, I mean, it's all what was mentioned before, that yeah, resources would be needed directly and also via experts, stakeholders, scientists or NGOs even for the developing world to get a better idea and share information and experiences. We see a lot of data missing from the global south, and this of course can have an effect in taking decisions. We have seen also that one model does not fit all. Sometimes examples that we have in the north don't fit in the south. So these things, they need to be considered and adapted. Also training and support of, as we said, of local scientists and laboratories to perform and deliver for this work needed, and also for the data to be comparable, especially, you know, when we're talking about effectiveness evaluation of the treaties. These are very important. And then, of course, what was mentioned by Juliet, this communication and how the science is understood and perceived, because it can be really, you know, interpreted in different ways. And if some things are seen in like abstract, they can mean something completely different from what they were meant to be when someone was in the discussions or when they are put in the relevant context. I can stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. We are a bit over time, so Tanmyun in 30 seconds, please.
Yes, I would say that the global science policy body can also really help to address these issues by providing the authoritative, the scientific voice. So I think that's what we have seen in the climate field. So we have not, we need good communication ways and also need credible information sources to support the communication. That would be my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanmyun. So with this, yeah, I think I would invite Bala to summarize what you have heard and perhaps in closure of this event. And so sorry for the going over time, but can you do it in 2 minutes, Bala?
Sure, certainly. Thanks a lot. Very, very sort of valid, very useful, and very pertinent points raised by all the panelists based on their experience and work on the ground, also working with science and policy. Certainly, the last parting points from all the panelists are very relevant. And of course, a key point that we always struggle when we are discussing science policy interface are two. One is access to data, information, and science. Because to an extent, science, even today, to an extent, is a little elitist. It is only for a small group of scientists and their peers. They understand what these issues are, what is forthcoming, what is evolving. So the first part of it is that we certainly need better data, information management, and governance policies. That is also related to the question in the chat box on how do we deal with misinformation. So as of now, we still are struggling when it comes to environmental management issues, having a kind of a governance policy on data and information. I think that is something which needs to be properly put in place. Related to that is that how do we communicate, whether it is science or the policy? And today, if you are going to be talking about communicating any of the decisions, for example, by the governments or by the private sector to general public out there, to make an impactful behavioral change on the ground, one of the tools that is used, which is very popular in social sciences, is called social proofing. How do we ensure what we are doing, whether it is science or whether it is policy, just not only impacts them, but relates to them in a day-to-day life. That is something which we need to basically be focusing on. And communicating some of them to the general public out there is extremely important. And that is where we need to engage more with policymakers, politicians, parliamentarians as well. Because to an extent, science may be there. There may be a willingness from the society to look for options and alternates. But if the policy environment is not conducive, always we end up having challenges. And that is why we at UNEP are looking at a holistic engagement with a number of stakeholders on addressing some of these issues. And that is why the social sciences aspects of dealing with science policy society interface is something which is going to be very important. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bala. Very good summary. Access communication towards. So thank you. And sorry for extending 5 minutes. And I'm not going to say any substantive words. Just hoping that we can see many people in the forthcoming side events and COP meeting. And we look forward to further discussion on science policy interface. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you, Dora-san. Thank you very much. Thanks, colleagues. See you.
Thank you.